Mixing with Mike mixing tip, using distortion for depth and focus. What I want to do here is I want to go back to the Mixing with Mike class session here. And during this class, what we focused on was adding or using distortion to create depth and imaging quality in the production. And I've focused on two basic aspects of it. And so I want to do kind of an overview, play a couple of samples here so you can understand a little bit of what's going on, and then talk a little bit about why it works. So essentially what I have here in the song is a couple of tube saturators. So if you watch the plugin of the week from the previous week's class, you'll see that we added in these tube saturation things, which I liked a lot, so I kept it in. And primarily what it is it's driving one form of distortion through 12AX7s or a 12AU7, and then you have some tone controls which work on a Baxandall kind of EQ. And then you have a mix control, so you could kind of determine or set up exactly how you want this to play in. In this case, it looks like I have this particular... so I can bring in so that would be all distortion. And then here I had a mix. And you could hear how it brings in body here. Like, so here it was bringing in some low end. And here a lot of the low end is bringing in just body on the snare, as well as top end presence. And this is mixed in or blended in with a little wet dry control. And this is individual processing. And this is used a lot, quite often on certain things. Like a lot of plugins will have like a drive control, where you get like a more subtle form of distortion. Like here on the vocal, I use the Slate Digital VMR and I use the FG73, and this is sort of driving a little bit of harmonic distortion. Now, this is a much more subtle form of harmonic distortion, but the same basic idea, where a little bit of overdrive is helping to create an edge or an aliveness or a character to the sound. It adds some depth. And I'm going to explain why, how that works in a minute. So when you start off by placing this on individual tracks, the thing you need to be careful about is that you're not just saturating it it's not necessarily about bringing in like some kind of guitar amps distortion or some really heavy type of distortion. Sometimes that's necessary. Maybe if you have a really dry track, it's more about bringing an edginess or an aliveness to it. If you can imagine, essentially when you overdrive something, when you saturate it, you're feeding more signal in than the component, whether it's a tube or a transformer or some other solid state component can handle. And by overdriving it, what happens is as you start to push signal in, none more comes out. It becomes sort of a brick wall limiter type of thing. And then you get this distortion component, which is added in. And then depending upon the style of component, it'll bring in different levels of odd and even harmonics. Now, when you do that and you bring that character in and you mix some of that in, what you get is sort of like shaking up an instrument or making it vibrate. And this is what makes or creates a kind of aliveness to the sound. This is really an effective technique for working with bass, which is why there's so much in terms of reamping. Like here, even working with this SVT emulation, where I'm driving in some signal, I may not be overloading or overdriving the preamp going in necessarily, but there's a distortion that happens in running through all of the components of the Ampeg and then running through the cabinet and selecting the microphone and all of that sort of stuff and placement. And all of those components give it a certain character, add an edge or a distortion. So there's a cumulative effect that kind of comes into this. When using analog components, like, here, like the Shep 73, this is going to add in with the preamp setting a little flavor, a little harmonic distortion kind of flavor. What I've done here is something with the tube saturator is something that is a little more aggressive and a little more to the point. And by creating that little vibration, especially on low-end instruments, what happens is they tend to image better in the speakers. Because when something is moving, it's easier for your brain to localize it. And this is part of why it works. So in other words, if you have sort of a stationary object, and in this case it's a sound, and you're trying to localize that sound, if it's sort of steady, especially at a low frequency, it's much harder to hear. But the more it's fluctuating, moving, vibrating, and what those vibrations and that distortion does is it brings in higher frequencies. It starts to bring out higher harmonics that allow your brain to kind of fill out and localize and position that instrument, place it in the speakers. And this translates also through headphones. So it's something that gets added in and works. Now, in the process of doing this, there are two ways to do it. In this case, we're doing sort of a parallel thing, but you can also bring it in as a parallel track. Like many people do like a parallel compression track. A classic thing for drums is to bring in an 1176 with all the ratio buttons put in, and then you get it to really pump very heavily, pump and breathe very heavily in an extreme kind of way. And this breathes a lot of life into the sound. But you can also run a parallel here, and a classic one to use is the decapitator. What I'm doing here is just kind of selecting from the console type of distortion, in this case a Neve, going into punish mode, so it's like driving way, way more level than what it can handle, like driving a line level signal into a mic amp or something. And then I have a drive control and the tone controls, which are really critical to setting up the sound. The idea here is that by shifting the tone of the distortion, I can control the aspects of it that make the drum kit or the sounds kind of sit. So if we listen to just the bass and the drums, we can start here by... there's also some guitars here in the background, so we're going to kind of... And so now if I take these two here, so I have one on the bass and one on the drums, I'm going to take it out so you can kind of hear what's going on. So what you can hear there is like a sense of depth and openness that appears. It's almost like the whole thing just blows out, and then there's a kind of an aggressiveness and an excitement that kind of gets drawn into the track. And that's the idea. That's what you're looking for. Now, how you focus that in is going to be a little bit different for every type of song. Essentially, the way that I'm setting it up here is I'm doing sends. I can adjust the levels of the send. So one of the things in particular for drums that I've found in different effects is adjusting the effects levels that are going into that parallel channel. So as you adjust these effects levels, you can, sometimes reverb can actually make things fuzz out a little bit too much. You want to be careful that the distortion creates a focus with the track, because when you kind of brick wall limit distort something, and then you bring some of that level in, essentially what you're doing is you're creating a solidity, almost like an RMS heavy signal that stays almost sort of static but is vibrating. And what that does, because those transient peaks in that dynamic movement is now missing. And what it does is it brings in a presence and a solidity into the sound, because the lower level energy is not getting distorted as much, and that's coming up as well. And so it brings in sort of low level compression style, but distorting the top down, that energy and that focus. So as you bring that up, you'll feel like a depth coming in. And the amount of the different reverbs and things that you feed into that is going to play a big component in that. So let's add in the guitars and just kind of show you what it is from that perspective. And then what I'll do is I'll A/B the bass distortion parallel, the guitar distortion parallel, on the drum distortion, and the guitar distortion parallel all at the same time. So if you notice like how flat it is and how much it opens up when this comes in. It's more than it just being louder. There is some of that, obviously. And then we could do the same type of thing with vocals. So the idea then is by bringing in this sort of present energy, and to be clear, it's not necessarily going to work with every song and every style of music. It happens to be more particularly appropriate to this because it is, sort of a pop, edgy kind of rock track, maybe, somewhat Avril Lavigne-ish if you want to go that direction. And so that type of sound you can get edgy and distorted, and it actually works to your advantage. It helps to hype up and bring up the energy of something. And distortion is a really, really powerful way of doing that. It's a way of taking a particular performance that maybe is, lacks a little bit of dynamic and energy and giving it an aggressiveness. Or if you have like a vocal that is maybe like a little bit on the bland side, like well performed, but not necessarily inspiring people to go running around or dancing or whatever. And you could put some kind of distortion, like a quite a common effect is like a megaphone effect, where it's distorted and very filtered down, and then all of a sudden the energy of that voice changes completely. And it's like just a production technique and a way of bringing in some depth and edge. But it is that distortion, that edginess, that sort of crazy vibration with the upper harmonics that actually start to, pull out and bring things to life. And that's the basic idea of it. There are many different levels of it, as I talked about it. There are more subtle levels by using analog plugins and analog components. There's heavier, like saturation plugins. There are many, many, many really good ones that are out there that you can play around with. They all have different designs. Find one that works. I've done this even like if you work with Pro Tools, you have the Sans amp. That works amazing. When you start going through just some of those different settings, you can dial in all different kinds of tones with it. And that's really the key. You need something that's going to allow you to adjust the tonal character. So when you kind of mix that in, it gives it like a character. Along with the depth and the height that you're looking for. All right, that's the basics of that, and that is the mixing tip of the week, using distortion for depth and focus.